Hello, Acid Horizon listeners. It is the month of June, and we have just concluded our 5th month of the Anti-Oedipus Files, a reading group that we are conducting alongside the reading of Anti-Oedipus happening in the Discord server called the Schizoanalysis Project. The question is it too late to join the Anti-Oedipus Files? No, it is not, because all of the readings that we do there function as standalones. As we move into Chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus in the Schizoanalysis Project, we are now turning to the portion of the book where we talk about Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the role of Nietzsche's work and anthropology in Deleuze and Guattari's historical and ethnographic analysis of the concept of desire. What you are about to listen to right now is a portion of a Patreon exclusive that featured Taylor Adkins from the podcast Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We brought Taylor into the fray to discuss the work of Lacan and an essay that's actually mentioned in Anti-Oedipus called Position of the Unconscious. But in this discussion, we talk about Lacan's work more broadly. Lacan the man, his history, how he came about, his origin story, as it were. And then, of course, we get into the text and into Lacan's theory more generally. This discussion is a solid hour and 48 minutes. So if you are already a sustainer on the Acid Horizon Patreon account, you are ready to enjoy this. It will be in the RSS feed that you get when you subscribe to the Acid Horizon Patreon. And it is also on our Patreon account where you're going to find all of the other recordings to all of the previous reading groups, including a reading group that has yet to begin. It's actually beginning this month. If you would like to read with us this summer only, Pierre Klosowski's Living Currency and some other essays that Klosowski wrote as a follow-up to our recent Nietzsche in the Vicious Circle reading group, which just concluded last month. This reading group will be run by myself and a friend of ours named Justin, who you may have heard on the podcast before. He's an avid reader of Klosowski's work and somebody who is quite apt to introduce to you Klosowski's concepts. This is easier and cheaper than going to graduate school, than investing yourself for 2 to 5 to 10 years in an institution that may put you in debt and may make you feel very sad at the end of the day. We will make you feel happy, and you can back out anytime, and it's like $5 a month. So join our Patreon account now. I also just want to say thank you to everybody who supported my Kickstarter campaign for Vintagia, the I Ching Oracle for psychogeography and creative discovery. I call it an oracle, but it is much more than that. It's a way to instigate your creativity that uses oracular wisdom and a series of activities based on chance that prompt you to think more creatively. If you did not get a chance to back the campaign, well, at the time that I'm releasing this, I think there will be 8 days left in the campaign, so you can drop down into the show notes, click on the link, and you can become one of the final supporters of that campaign. There may be a surplus in July or August when I finally produce these decks, in addition to the surplus of Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille decks that are coming very, very soon. I get emails about that deck every day. Just pay attention to our social media, pay attention to this space, and you're going to hear more about that very soon. Anyway, I've talked quite a bit more than normal today, so let's get on to today's discussion with Taylor Adkins. And as I said, if you are a patron, you're listening to the whole thing right now. And if you get our podcast feed elsewhere, well, you'll get about a half hour right now, but why not join the fray? Become a patron today. Head to the show notes and get the rest of our discussion on Lacan. Okay, let's begin. All right, welcome everybody. It is May 2025, the last day of the month, and this weekend we are continuing the Anti-Oedipus Files with a session on Lacan's position of the unconscious. Now, of course, Lacan is a central figure in not only in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, but in the text Anti-Oedipus more specifically. And I have to admit my own paucity of understanding of Lacan's work, and that's one of the reasons I brought in somebody who knows this territory much better than I do. That is Taylor Adkins of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. And if you are listening to this on our live Patreon feed, I highly encourage you to navigate to the show notes. Make sure you subscribe to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour and support their work like you support our work. They are doing great work in Deleuze and Guattari studies, Laruelle, post-structuralism, broadly construed. So definitely sign up for their talks. Today, like I said, we are talking about Lacan's position of the unconscious with Taylor, but I also wanted to make this an opportunity to be a sort of audio primer of sorts. And I think the first thing that we're going to do is just talk about Lacan, the man, his work, and build a little foundation on which to understand this text in particular and how it's situated amidst the rest of Lacan's seminars and writings. But without further ado, let me introduce Taylor. And Taylor, a lot of people here already know you. I'd probably say 85% of the people, 90% of the people listening know who you are. Maybe just give a little bit of introduction to yourself and a background about what's going on with you and maybe even Cooper and the podcast recently.
Yeah, Craig, thank you so much. And I appreciate you having me on. And I told you earlier, I do not pretend to be the subject supposed to know. It's just that, as basically, as you know, you can't really read Deleuze and Guattari too long without having to sort of try to nestle into what Lacan's doing. In terms of just my background, I've been a translator of French philosophy for a little over 15 years. It began with a kind of serendipitous happenstance contract with Semiotext translating Guattari's Machinic Unconscious, which he describes as a handbook to 1,000 plateaus. It was kind of surprising when I first started looking at the thinkers that Deleuze calls upon, like in 1,000 Plateaus or his other work. So many of them had not been translated, including some of Guattari's solo work, most of which now has been. There's still some things here and there. But at the time, Machinic Unconscious had not been translated. And so that got me started, got me bit by the translation bug. And I've, as you mentioned, I've worked on some other thinkers, translating Laruelle here and there, people like Simondon, which I've been on your podcast to talk about. And, I joined Cooper in 2020, maybe late 2019. It feels like right around, it's hard to remember with these things, but we've been working together for probably about 5 years. And I know that there was another serendipitous happenstance was that he had recently changed. I don't remember the original name of the podcast, but before we met, he had changed it to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. So that is not my responsibility. That is not like me conferring the title to the podcast. That is just an absolute sort of chance occurrence. And we began our collaboration just sort of running through the first half of that work by Guattari and sort of diving into it, because I don't think he had read it by then, but probably thought, "Oh, Machine Unconscious, that's a cool name."
And it Super Guattario Brothers.
Well, that's what he named the little series before we formally started collaborating. He just had me on as a recurring guest for that series, but he called it, the Super Guattario Brothers. We had at the time, he goes by DC. He's a sort of a longtime Twitter. He's a trained psychoanalyst. We had him on to do it with us, and our old friend Anthony was joining us sometimes. So we had a kind of a little group beyond just me and Coop. But nowadays, Coop and I are, I'm trying to get him going through 1,000 Plateaus. We've done the first 3. We're probably going to do more. He wants to do What is Grounding, that lecture series that was discovered, transcripts of from Deleuze from 1956, one of the earliest. Yeah, that's basically the earliest transcripts we have of Deleuze. He wants to dive deeper into Deleuze's work. And, tomorrow we're interviewing Eugene Holland.
Oh, cool.
Who's publishing kind of like a collection of his essays. And so we get to talk to, we've had him on the show twice now, and we'll get to talk to him. He's kind of a well-respected Deleuzean. As you know, he wrote, I think, one of the first in English sort of reader's guides to Anti-Oedipus, right? So some of the people in the TSP and the Schizoanalysis Project have been looking at least I assume have been looking at his reader's guide to, which I think, for example, for a concept like anti-production, he puts a lot of effort in there, where I think Deleuze and Guattari sort of never fully explicate it. Unlike some other concepts where they really try, even if they remain obscure, like body without organs, they really do try to give us some more meat. In any case, I do recommend that for those just getting into Anti-Oedipus, thinking about it. Look at Gene Holland's book. It's very helpful.
For me, that book was absolutely indispensable in terms of approaching Anti-Oedipus for the first time. I mean, what else can I say? And at the time, that was more than 15 or almost 20 years ago. And, these days we have much more to work with. We're on the third wave of Deleuze and Guattari scholars here in the Anglophone world. So
I still think that Anti-Oedipus is generally not as focused on as either the monographs, even or What is Philosophy or A Thousand Plateaus. It's almost maybe treated more as a historical moment. Like that immediate post 68 reaction. It's almost like taken for granted rather than as fully mined conceptually as it could be. And I don't just mean that in English scholarship. You can see that as a trend in French scholarship, that there's not as much as you might expect, at least in book form. I know that if you looked at the articles, you'd find more work, but still as a trend, Anti-Oedipus is largely, still to be, there's still things in it to be discovered, which is why we did the reading group, right?
Yeah.
Or why we are doing.
Right. And when I talked to Henry Summers Hall recently, he admitted that he's like, I'm much more fluent in A Thousand Plateaus than Anti-Oedipus. And I'm surprised to hear that. I think given how important Anti-Oedipus was in terms of my entree to the work.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think it's interesting, right? Because it does feel like, chapter 1 has a manifesto feel. And chapter 2 tries to ground this historically in the attack on psychoanalysis. And then chapter 3 feels like a very long plateau, or like it could fit in between or around, plateau 12, 13 on nomadology and apparatus of capture, right? It has a feel of what is to come. And then I think chapter 4, which we'll get into soon, obviously, in Anti-Oedipus, by the way, kind of, at least, again, and this is maybe why the unity of the book is already rhizomatic and multiplicitous, right? That 4th chapter kind of tries to lay out the stakes for what schizoanalysis could do beyond the first destructive moment of sort of the curettage of the unconscious, as they call it, to building on these positive principles. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's kind of a weird liminal book, right? It doesn't quite maybe cohere as much, but cohere is not even the right word, because A Thousand Plateaus, as you know, is sort of like the plateaus bleed into each other, right? But it is interesting. You're right. I've heard others speak something similar to what Summers Hall said, right? That A Thousand Plateaus is more conducive to coming back to and rereading and mining for different theoretical lines of flight, whereas Anti-Oedipus is almost, it's almost propedeutic for that work. So, but I do know, just the reason why we're talking about Anti-Oedipus is not just a pitch for the TSP, right, Craig? But this is when they quote Lacan and Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari actually quote this piece.
Yes,
right.
That's why we picked this piece. You were the one who helped me pick this for the Anti-Oedipus Files.
I at the time, because I've been putting some research into our discussion, I didn't know as much history behind the specific text as I did sort of researching the background for it in this past week. I had read it. I've pretty much read everything in the Acri, though not as thoroughly as I would like. There's some that I come back to more often than not, like Kant with Sade, or obviously the Purloined Letter, right, which he puts at the front of the Acri instead of chronologically, which is the one text in the Acri that's sort of out of order chronologically. That's a text that, like, for example, if you're going into literary studies, they're going to want you to read that. That gives you a nice mesh of the psychoanalytic and the and sort of the literary world with Poe. And then, of course, there's the Mirror Stage essay, which is very early Lacan. This text is interesting. And I did tell you, Craig, and I'm trying to reiterate for not just those present with us here in case they missed it, but for those listening either alongside or after the fact in the recording, that I was going to start with maybe 10 maybe 15 minutes of just situating this historically and
Sure.
what was going on with Lacan. And then we can maybe dive into the text and pull out some threads.
Actually, can I? I'm
Yes,
going to
please.
a little nudge too, or maybe just to kind of tweak the algorithm. One of my first questions was basically exactly what you proposed here is like, how do we situate Lacan's concept of the unconscious within
Mm-hmm.
the broader history of psychoanalysis? You know, the whole claim that the unconscious is structured like a language. But maybe another important piece here that I just thought of on the fly is Lacan's relationship with Guattari.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought it was interesting from the perspective of just a human narrative. It kind of carries, you know, if it were a fiction, you know, well, it is a story, but imagining it as a story or as a fiction, it has this sort of a break with the mentor trope to it. And clearly that personal relationship plays into the philosophical and perhaps even some of the political implications of Anti-Oedipus and the way perhaps that it folds back onto Lacan's work. Because, I mean, I know I've joked online that Lacan was very upset with, you know, this book coming out, but you know, my experience with a lot of the French writers is there's an ambivalent relationship between all of them. It's very love-hate. Even between like Deleuze and Foucault, for example, there was, you know, a massive respect there, but also kind of, you know, there's some friction as well, as I understand it too. And so maybe we can kind of build that into the opening narrative.
Yeah, this is interesting with Guattari. So I'll go ahead and have to bleed a little bit into the historical account, but I can tell it out of order. So in 64, or at the end of 63, when Guattari is still a student, still a sort of practicing, you know, analyst, we'd say under Lacan, still a Lacanian, if you want to call it that. In 63, basically, there is something called the French Society of Psychoanalysis. And in order for them to keep their credentials in the International Psychoanalytic Association, they had to drop Lacan.
Hmm.
I'm diving sort of in the middle of this history that's going on, and I'll try to fill in some gaps, which is great that we're actually starting with some gaps, since that's how Lacan sort of situates the subject in the interstice between signifiers. So we're going to sort of jump in medias res. And basically, you know, when this conference 1960 happens, so the actual conference at which Lacan was supposed to have given this paper, the Bonneval Colloquium in 1960, this was already looming on the horizon that the ES, sorry, I'm trying to think what we call it, what would the French call it? It was the French Society. Yeah, I guess it doesn't matter. So the French Society, the EFS, sorry, I think, right? Or the EPS. Maybe it's the Parisian. I'm mixing up my terms for, because Freud Lacan will found the EFS, right? The École Freudienne. He's gonna found his Freudian school, but the school of which he was a part, that was a member of the IPA, which is also a funny term. I'm just thinking about alcohol now. But in any case, so basically, Lacan was not liked for a number of reasons. And the reason why they wanted to get rid of him was a couple of things. First of all, as you know, it's not just political, but part of it is political. Part of the politics is the sort of Anglo-American contingent was moving much more in line with what Anna Freud was sort of doing after her father's death, and the route she was taking, psychoanalysis, was very much into a kind of ego psychology, into a kind of what we need to do in analysis, training analysts and working with analysans, is to strengthen the ego. By strengthening the ego, we can prepare patients to face the cruel reality that confronts all of us, right? And from the very beginning of Freud's seminars in 53, Freud is already pushing back against this ego defense, ego psychology. And so, you know, you could imagine, so by the end of the 50s, around this time even, and Lacan gives us little hints that even in 1960 at this colloquium, there was already a kind of pall, shroud, a cloud overhanging his, whether or not he would be officially like licensed and credentialed by this international body. And that's part of his complaints about, you see at the note that he's leaving, and then he has the editors, right, where he's kind of kvetching about this 4-year delay between the conference and when the papers are resubmitted and rewritten, and the fact that his circumstances led him to be in this weird position in 1960 at the colloquium, where he's not only sort of presiding over, and his students are Laplanche and Leclerc are presenting, and he's kind of situating the notion of the unconscious, which is the sort of theme of the colloquium, but that is his position there, his basically his on the risk of being booted out of this association, that makes him wish there would have been like recordings and transcripts. Anyway, so he gives all of this in little details here, and he goes into it a lot more in Seminar 11, which is one of the most famous. It's one of the earliest published, if not the first translated into English. He gives, in that very first session, he sort of runs through it all. But in any case, you asked about Guattari, and I would just say that in 63, when he's kicked out, and in 64, in the middle of 64, in June, he will form his new school, and he's going to take a lot of the people that were in. He's going to take over 100 people that were in the sort of the French society. He's going to take them into his new school. Guattari is going to be one of them, but that's going to be very short-lived. And the reason for that there's a lot more that we could go into, but Guattari had been more or less been groomed to sort of take up the torch and been one of the ones groomed, right, to take up the torch and follow him, right? He had been known as sort of, he'd been known as Little Lacan. You see this in Das's biography of Deleuze and Guattari. He had sort of memorized all of Lacan's formulations, but I do think that by 65, if not shortly thereafter, he's already breaking away from Lacan, and it's hard to know exactly all of the details. Das gives us a little bit of this, but not as much as one might want. But still, at this time, when the new school is founded, when Lacan, in sort of a defiance, right, is starting the school and calling it the Freudian school, it's interesting. There's a few things I would go into, and I wish I could tell you more about the actual beef with Guattari. I think part of it, we can retroactively read that he began to be dissatisfied with this emphasis on signifiers, right? We see that in Anti-Oedipus, we see that in his own solo writing, and we see how much this whole position of the unconscious essay is still largely centered around that, because this is the period, this early 60s period, when Lacan is infusing this Freudian return with the linguistic thinkers like Jakobson or Saussure, or even the structuralism of Levi-Strauss, right? So that's, if we wanted to figure out the less biographical and personal reasons why maybe Guattari is dissatisfied with this paternal relationship he obviously had, and then was replaced more or less by Jacques-Alain Miller, who's going to marry Lacan's daughter and kind of take Guattari's place there. If we want to forgo that biographical analysis, I think that we could say maybe the theoretical divergences become clearer in the joint work he does with Deleuze, not just in Anti-Oedipus, but even like the very beginning of the Kafka minor literature book, where it's very clear that the enemy to approaching Kafka in literature is the signifier, right?
Let me stop you just for 1 second then. So given the timeline here, where does Guattari's relationship with Deleuze come in? How aware are they of each other's work, in the mid-60s to the late 60s? What's the sort of general timeline there?
So as far as we know, they were put into contact by a mutual friend and their first sort of exchange of letters occurs around, I think, mid-April of 69. And Guattari had written this essay, Machine and Structure, which becomes very influential for Deleuze. In fact, is part of his shift in his thinking about the method of philosophy. As you know, in philosophy, for Deleuze, the method of philosophy is interpretation. It's a very special kind of interpretation, just as in Lacanian analysis, interpretation is not hermeneutics, but interpretation in Nietzschean philosophy is the creations of the concepts of sense and value, the relating of values back to a genealogy of values, et cetera, right? And with Guattari, we see in Anti-Oedipus that the Machine and Structure essay, which is partly a view or a reflection on difference, repetition, and logic of sense, it forces Deleuze to get out of this impasse that we see him sort of cornering himself in by the end of Logic of Sense, which develops the serialism that is interested in elaborating a kind of very sophisticated structuralism. And Guattari is, with that essay, trying to show that, in fact, structure is dependent on what he calls machine. And this leads Deleuze not only to obviously write Anti-Oedipus with them and abandon interpretation, right, for experimentation or whatever you want to sort of throw in there for a stand-in, the rhizome, etc. But it also leads him to rewrite Proust and Signs in 1970 and add in this kind of anti-logos section, this machinic section. But then again in 1976, which is the same year they publish that introduction rhizome, he revises and adds a substantial section to Proust and Signs again, making it what it is we have today with the complete text translation. But it first came out in 64, and it changes very substantially right off the bat within a year of meeting Guattari. But Guattari had written this Machine and Structure and sent it to Deleuze, and that was one of their first exchanges. And they had some exchanges of letters, and then were able to, as I said, be put in contact with his friend, and that set them on their collaboration. And by 1970, their first piece they publish in a review of Lasowski's work. It's basically roughly translated as the disjunctive synthesis.
Yes.
I don't think there's an official translation of that, but if you look on academia.edu, you can find someone has done a translation of it. But they also cited an Anti-Oedipus, but this is, and it's reworked in that opening chapter, by the way, that will become the sort of kernel out of which the crystal of Anti-Oedipus will grow. So already within that first year, they're publishing. And in that 1970, that second edition of Proust and Signs, Deleuze is already talking about Guattari's notion of transversality. And Deleuze is writing about how this is he's moved from this language, talking about Proust, from this language of essence to this language of transversality. So Guattari had some immediate effects on Deleuze's writing, and the immediate effect that Deleuze had on Guattari's writing was to sort of get Guattari out of his writing block and to get him committed to writing. And Guattari has mixed feelings about this. You see this in the Anti-Oedipus papers, but for the most part, Deleuze's main thing was getting Guattari to sort of barf out the schizomaniacal flows, as he says. And so I guess all of that is baked into the cake here. And one of the reasons why, and again, as I said, in Anti-Oedipus, they're citing this paper, and I'm not exactly sure why out of all of the decree, that's the one they cite. But real quickly, before we dive into the text. So in 1960, there's the colloquium where this paper is given. Laplanche and Leclerc, two of his most prominent students, give papers there. It's on the theme of the unconscious, which, as we know, is one of the four fundamental concepts that Kahn's going to lay out in the seminar of 64, the year that he revises and publishes this text. It's dated, March 64. And the seminar would have already been full underway. So it had been like right in the middle of that year's seminar. And then a few months later, he's going to form this new school. So in the interim between this conference getting kicked out of the IPA and the and then the revision and publication for this. And then it's, of course, again, revised at last minute in 1966 with the actual publication of a decree, which has its own fascinating history. The only thing I do want to point out, because I know that the most important thing I feel in this text, or at least in the history of this text, would be